Good evening, and welcome to the first Elizabeth Evans Baker lecture, since the 1980s anyway, in Peace Studies and World Order. We're delighted that tonight's speaker, Professor Amitav Acharya, has piqued your interest, and I hope that we'll be able to present kind of different perspectives on peace studies, and the state of the world in this lecture series in the years to come every fall. My name is Ingo Trauschweitzer. I'm the director of the Contemporary History Institute, and I suppose the typical procedure now would be, introduce the speaker and we'd get on with things. But this evening I'll invite my colleague and friend Nuket Sandal, our, dynamic director of global studies and Empress of War and Peace Studies, among other things, to do so because she, in fact, knows our speaker much better. But I'd also like to say a few things about this new and old Baker lecture series, and you kind of have to wonder, we're in the Baker Ballroom in the Baker Center for the Baker lecture, and whether the Bakers have done anything for us lately. So the reason this has anything to do with the Contemporary History Institute is a kind of an Austria-Hungary situation, in that from the inception of the two programs in the 1980s, they've been joined at the hip. They're not exactly the same, but they're also kind of very closely tied. So CHI operates in many respects the Baker Peace Studies programming. And of course, as many of you know, every spring we get to run the Baker Peace Conference, and have done so since about the mid-1980s, to honor the legacy of John Calhoun Baker, former university president. But when I took on the job as CHI director, one of the things, this might be my either Teutonic a sort of version of OCD, or the fact that I'm a historian, I went to the archives and wanted to learn a little bit about the inception of these programs, and what in fact, if anything, distinguished the Contemporary History Institute on the one hand, Baker Peace Studies on the other, and found that Elizabeth Evans Baker was kind of the programmatic force behind all of this drive. There's a lot of letters between her and John Lewis Gaddis, who founded the Contemporary History Institute, and it was really her who wanted to get the Peace Studies program off the ground, except she didn't really want to call it Peace Studies. She wanted something in the Peace Studies and World Order, which is why I figured that would be a good title for the lecture series, and Gaddis kept telling her that you needed something shorter. Her objection, as best I could tell, to Peace Studies was that it smacked a little bit too much of sort of rather naive protesters, in her view. Anyway, that's a slight paraphrase of a letter that you could find in Charlie Pink's papers at the Mann Center at Alden. And the other point I noticed was that in the beginning, in about the mid-1980s, there were 3 or 4 Elizabeth Evans Baker lectures. And then that kind of went away, and I think it got overshadowed by the Baker Peace Conference. But thanks to the generosity and the vision of the Baker family, now Anne Baker, their daughter, we're now in a position to offer both. We can run a first-rate conference each fall. Each spring, and we can offer the keynote lecture in the fall. And I think it's appropriate that we kind of pay homage to the person who more than anyone actually helped to get this off the ground, as well as, in fact, the Peace and Diplomacy Studies program at Dartmouth. So she was quite dialed into that community. So that's enough for me. I would like to ask Nuket Sandal to introduce our speaker, and then hope you will all enjoy the talk. I was just reminded, though, by Connie Hunter that for those of you who want to ask questions later, to do so at the microphone, because this is being recorded, and otherwise the sound won't make it.
Thank you very much, Ingo. And I will roll with that Empress of War and Peace Studies forever. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It's my honor tonight to introduce our speaker, Professor Amitav Acharya. When we were brainstorming about who to invite as the first speaker of the Baker Peace lecture, we all agreed that our speaker would need to be a world-class scholar who addressed global issues and challenges we are facing today. Professor Acharya's groundbreaking work in the field of international relations has inspired many, including myself, in the academic and policy worlds. Professor Acharya is the UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance and Distinguished Professor at the School of International Service, American University, Washington, D.C. His many books include Constructing Global Order, The End of American World Order, Why Govern, Rethinking Demand and Progress in Global Governance, The Making of Southeast Asia, Whose Ideas Matter, and Constructing a Security Community in Southeast Asia. I will leave it here because Professor Acharya publishes a new book every 3 months. So his essays also have appeared in leading international affairs journals, and his work has been featured in many news outlets, including Financial Times, Washington Post, CNN International, and BBC. Beyond this distinguished scholarship, however, there is something I would like to emphasize about Professor Acharya. While challenging his colleagues to think about international order beyond the Western conceptualizations, Professor Acharya also worked very hard to make the interdisciplinary study of international studies inclusive and welcoming to scholars coming from the global South. He is the first non-Western scholar to be elected as the president of the International Studies Association in 2015. And for those of you who don't know, this organization is the largest global network of international studies scholars from different disciplines with more than 8,000 members. I remember, as an ISA member, how much of an exciting moment this was for all of us. At ISA, this International Studies Association organization conference, every president selects 1 or 2 colleagues to prepare the gigantic annual convention. During his presidency, Professor Acharya selected 2 amazing women to prepare the ISA program together. Lili Ling, whose brilliant work focused on post-Westphalian politics, non-Western feminism, and Chinese politics, and Pınar Bilgin, a prominent scholar of critical security studies from Turkey. I also know from experience that Professor Acharya has always strictly demanded global South and gender representation in all his programming, and he has been a strong advocate for seeing the world as truly global and going beyond the white interpretations of the world orders. He is one of those scholars who has changed the face of international studies scholarship as we know it. This is a critical moment for all of us to read Professor Acharya's work, hear his voice, and engage his questions. As you can see, I can continue to talk about what Professor Acharya means not just to international studies scholarship, but also to its scholars from all around the world with all their diversity. However, you are here to listen to Professor Acharya and not me, so I will not hold you any longer. Please join me in welcoming Professor Acharya to Ohio University.
Thank you, Professor Nuket Sandal, for your kind words, and also for inviting me to give this lecture. And also thank you, Professor Ingo Trausweiser, also for contacting me. He was the first one to actually send me an email inviting me to this lecture. But Nuket, thank you very much for mentioning the work of Lili Ling and Pınar Bilgin as my program chairs. And as many of you may already know, that's Professor Sandal is this year's program chair for the International Studies Association, our co-chair. And that's a very, very demanding job because you have to create more than 1,000 panels and roundtables involving 7,000 participants. And it is no mean task to navigate through that kind of, academics have big egos, and trying to satisfy 7,000 big egos is probably the most challenging job in academia, especially academic networking that I can think of in international relations. So I'm also very pleased that so many of you have turned up, despite the cold, and also you may have better things to do on a Thursday night, like going for a drink. I hear that Ohio University is the kind of party university that's got a well-deserved reputation. This is my second time at this university. And the two things I do as an academic, substance-wise, Southeast Asia and global order, both are very well represented at this university. So my first trip here was to give a talk at the Southeast Asia program at the Center for International Studies, which is a tremendous reputation worldwide as a Center for Southeast Asian Studies. So moving on, I would like to talk about is peace and cooperation possible after the liberal order? And we put a question mark there, partly because the dominant perspective now, especially the United States and the West, that it is not possible. That with the decline, if not the demise, of the liberal order, the world is catching fire, and all hell is breaking loose, and we are getting into a period of heightened anarchy and disorder. And I'll talk in a moment how that argument plays out, and I'll try to give my own perspective on that particular issue. First of all, let's take a look at what the mainstream liberal, both scholars and pundits, people who run things like the Council on Foreign Relations, are talking about. I do not mean to say this is by means the view of everybody or every scholar that or pundit that identifies with liberalism, but I think this is the dominant view, it's fair to say. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So Fareed Zakaria, and this is before the election of President Trump, by the way, in 2014. So Fareed Zakaria, whom everybody knows from CNN, wherever you look, the world seems on fire. Pretty dramatic. And Richard Haass, who is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the most important American liberal establishment think tank, has also been saying the same thing, both before and after Trump's election. So in 2014, he said, the question is not whether the world will continue to unravel, but how fast and how far. And in his more recent book, World in Disarray, which was published after the election of President Trump, the book calls itself, in the blurb, an examination of a world increasingly defined by disorder and the United States unable to shape the world in its image. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Now, this is particularly revealing because it directly links the decline of the United States or the absence of American leadership in international affairs that we associate with President Trump with global disorder. So if the United States cannot lead, then the world is going to fall apart. The center doesn't hold, things fall apart. And as I said, it's not by means everybody's view, but it is the view. I live in Washington, D.C. I see this all the time. And I see this discourse all the time. So I want to challenge this view. I just challenge this view because for a couple of reasons. I have done a lot of work on this, but from a bottom-up perspective. I grew up in India. I studied in Australia. I taught in Canada and United Kingdom, South Africa, and now the United States. So I do have not a totally global perspective, but a fairly round-up comprehensive view of what, and I study regionalism. That's one of my areas of interest. And I do think I have an idea of how people in different parts of the world think about the liberal order, and from different vantage points. I also spent quite a bit of time in China lately. So here is my take. Start with the myths about liberal hegemony. Now, when John Eikenberry from Princeton wrote about, he is the scholar that popularized the term liberal order more than anybody else, and a terrific scholar. He, in his book, The Liberal Leviathan, 2011, talked about something called liberal hegemonic order. It's not just a liberal order. It's an American-led liberal hegemonic order, meaning that the order is hegemonic. There is no competition, no contestation. Everybody accepts it. Hegemony, you know, is a term that can be, that is maintained through both coercion and consent. But he emphasized the consent aspect more than coercion, and said this is the order that is global, and not only this order will survive, but it will co-opt, it will incorporate any potential challenger, including countries like China, India, or the BRICS. Very optimistic view, very powerful view, and also very popular at its time. Now, my interest in global order and the liberal order came by reading that book. John is a very close friend of mine, and I correspond with him quite often on various things. But I just felt that this cannot go unchallenged. Because as somebody who spent a lot of time outside of the United States, and I started my IR theory as a liberal. I believe in institutions, interdependence, and democracy as forces for peace. But I thought the Panglossian view of liberal order was not true factually and also perceptually. And also presenting such an image of liberal order is normatively harmful, for the world. And I'll tell you why. First of all, it was not a global order. It was more like a club of the West. Many countries, China, India, and good deal of the non-Western world were not part of it. You can create a club and you can say everybody belongs to it. But the fact is that the liberal element of the liberal order was not shared. The liberal ethos was not shared by a lot of countries, including China and India and most of the third world. Most of the third world was non-aligned, not aligned with the West. India, being a democracy, was actually an ally of the Soviet Union, and China, certainly before the reforms, did not buy either capitalism or democracy, but even now doesn't buy democracy. So it was more like a club of the West, United States, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and maybe Japan, but certainly not global. It expanded after the end of the Cold War. And after the reforms of India and China, it certainly, one could say that it is taking on a global dimension. But even then, it was a selective appropriation by the liberal order of these countries, and these countries also, including the rising powers, did not sign on to all aspects of liberal order. China, of course, has signed on to, you can say, the market economy in some ways, but certainly not to the political dimensions of the liberal order. Secondly, it was not very orderly, and that was really one of the critical points I felt I needed to make, that the liberal order was associated with stability in Europe, mainly, and in fact, the only region that was free from major war was Europe. The global south was full of disorder, and sometimes the disorder was fueled by the liberal powers, including the United States. Regional conflicts were deemed actually permissible between the US and the Soviet Union, which could not fight directly with each other because of nuclear weapons. They actually thought they can let off steam in their tension in their relationship by having proxy wars in the global south. And in that sense, the Cold War was not a long peace for the global south. And there is plenty of evidence and statistical evidence. Almost 95% of conflicts in the world happened in the global south. And that included major wars, genocide, and wars that were fueled by external interventions, sometimes Soviet, but also quite a few times by the liberal countries, including the United States. Third, the liberal order had deep colonial roots. It coexisted with and sometimes sustained colonialism. until the 1960s. The United States and Britain opposed self-determination norm when the UN Human Rights Covenants were being drafted, initially at least. It was the global South countries, the post-colonial countries, which pushed for it. And the United States did not side with Vietnam, North Vietnam, against the French. And then it, of course, led to the escalation of United States involvement in Vietnam, and that is another example. The United States did not support India, which is a democracy, against a military dictatorship in Pakistan. For whatever reason, what I'm saying is that it had colonial roots, and also it had the relationship of the liberal countries was as much with illiberal states in the third world or global south than with democracies. International institutions and cooperation, and this is really at the heart of the liberal order. When Eikenberry talks about liberal order, he actually takes a very institutionalist view. The United States ruled the world through institutions. The Europeans ruled the world through colonialism and balance of power. According to this view, the United States ruled the world, or exercised its hegemony through institutions. And that's generally correct. But those institutions are dominated, they're created by the United States, and they're dominated by Western countries. That is changing today, especially in some institutions like WTO, but it still pretty much remains one of the legacies of the post-war liberal order. And that kind of Western dominance aggravated North-South conflict, because the southern states, then the global south states, created their own institutions like G77, for example, that demanded a new international economic order, or even a new international information order. Some of those non-aligned movement, which expanded to have more than 100 countries, and was kind of germinated at the Bandung Conference in 1955. So the global south went partly its own way to resist the liberal order, and at the very least, we had an aggravation of the North-South conflict. So the dream of President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, that we will have a universal international order was actually undermined because of these particularities, the clubbish nature of the Western liberal order. Now, having said that, let me also make one point. The liberal order was already in crisis well before President Trump took into office. Trump is, to me, the consequence or the symptom of the crisis of the liberal order, not the cause. So my book, The End of American World Order, the first edition was published in 2014. Actually, it was written at Oxford in 2013 when nobody thought Donald Trump will be a serious presidential candidate. Of course, everybody knew Donald Trump, but whether he will be a serious contender for the presidency, even he himself did not know that. But by that time, it was quite clear that the liberal order was unraveling, fraying, and it was fraying for long-term structural factors, and those factors had deep roots, and they are long-term roots, and they're creating a long-term transformation in world politics. And I want to talk a little bit about what those transformations are before we go to the question whether peace and cooperation is possible when the liberal order has. I don't think the liberal order will end, means it will die away, but it will just become one of the international orders, competing with various types of other international and regional orders. So I want to introduce 4 ideas here, which have been the basis of my work for the last 10 years, but especially the last 6 years. The first is the idea of a multiplex world, which is not a multipolar world. The notion of an idea shift as opposed to just the power shift. All the power shift is happening. The idea of fragmentation in global governance, which can have destructive, complementary, and creative consequences. And the idea of a G+ leadership as opposed to Ian Bremmer's idea of a G0 leadership. And again, what I say is these trends are long-term and predate the Trump presidency. All the President Trump can aggravate, he can push the liberal order over the edge, but he certainly did not create its decline. It did not trigger its decline. Now, what is a multiplex world? I think we need some new vocabulary for the 21st century. Multipolarity, everybody says, or most people think, after unipolar moment is over, we'll have a multipolar world. Because it's an easy term, it's out there. That's what the world used to be before World War II, and certainly in the 19th century and early 20th century. So people, academics usually, or pundits have it's easy to fall back on history and say history is going to repeat itself. Now they are really wrong here, because there is a huge difference between multipolarity and what we see today in terms of actors, the types of relationships we have, and the consequences of those relationships. So I want to start with a simple definition of multipolarity, which comes from Jacques Lady, a French political scientist. The French love multipolarity. Even during the bipolar era, they wanted France to be independent of the US and the Soviet Union, or the NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So it's probably just as well that we get a definition from a French political scientist. So it's a system in which power is distributed, at least among three significant poles, concentrating wealth and or military capabilities, and in which each of these poles is capable of producing order or generating disorder to influence global outcomes beyond its own borders. I've kind of tweaked it a little bit, but just generally those words. The sequence might be a little different, but it's based on its definition. Now, I think that kind of world is, I'm not denying that there is going to be more than three great powers in the contemporary international system, okay? So multipolarity is valid in one sense. But the distribution of power, multipolarity speaks to the distribution of power. That's only a small part of world order. That's a small part of what is going on today. There's a lot more things going on today that's not captured by the European or Eurocentric notion of multipolarity that we see today. First of all, I want to come back to some of the points of Leidy's definition directly, but I coin the term multiplex world, multiplexity, as opposed to multipolarity. Now, a multiplex world doesn't have a hegemon. That's the same as multipolarity. Multipolarity also doesn't have a hegemon. But I want to emphasize that, because even at the age of European multipolarity, Britain was the hegemon. So we had a multipolar world with Britain, France, now unified Germany, before that Prussia, and Russia, maybe Spain a little earlier. But the British were the hegemon. So multipolarity as a distribution of power and hegemonic outreach in terms of global power projection are not incompatible historically. I want to make sure that that's not what we are talking about. Multiplex world doesn't have a hegemon. Hegemony is very rare in international relations. Global hegemony. Regional hegemony is much more likely. So we had really two global hegemons, maybe three. I mean, you can bring in Spain, but really Britain and the United States have been the only real global hegemons with the ability to project power and influence outcomes, including domestic outcomes, in most parts of the world. The British through colonialism, United States through its power. And I don't think a multiplex world doesn't have a hegemon. It's culturally and politically diverse. Now, this idea of a global village, that homogeneity to globalization, I don't think that's overstretched. There is a bit of globalization in the world. It's not blurring the diversity, political and cultural diversity. Francis Fukuyama, as he has admitted now, history is never ending. There is always going to be competing political and economic systems. Even the Chinese who have accepted capitalism, their capitalism is very different from your capitalism. State-controlled capitalism versus private free market capitalism, very different things. So political and cultural diversity remains, and it has to be highlighted, which is not there in the original, the Leidy definition of multipolarity. Now, but economically and functionally interdependent. So you can have cultural and political diversity, but you can still be bound by economic, and by functional, I mean issues that make you interdependent, because you can only solve them through cooperation or interaction, like climate change. No single country is going to solve climate change. It is sort of by nature, it requires international cooperation. So because of the rise of global issues like climate change, pandemics, migration, refugee flows, transnational crime, terrorism, countries have a new layer of interdependence, and also economic interdependence. Now, this is not new. But 19th century economic interdependence was mainly among European countries. The rest of the world was dependent, not interdependent with Europe, because they were colonies of Europe. And secondly, that interdependence was dominated by trade and exchange. Today's interdependence is much more complex. It's trade, it's finance, it's production networks, it's supply chains, plus all these global issues that create common sense of sensitivity and vulnerability, which are key ingredients of interdependence. So you have no hegemon, diversity culturally, politically, but economic and functional interdependence. Where the ability of producing order, and this is really key, producing order or generating disorder to influence global or cross-border outcomes lies not just with great powers, but with non-state actors, such as institutions, I'm talking international and regional institutions, corporations, extremists, and social movements, using both material and ideational resources. Now, the multipolar world that we know was a world of great powers. So it was almost the concept of Europe in the 19th century. The great powers were the dominant actors. There were very few international institutions. In fact, much of the 19th century, the biggest institution was a European institution called the Concert of Powers. And the Universal Postal Union, maybe. But today we have thousands and thousands of institutions, and there is a reason. I know there is a lot of skepticism about institutions, but there is a reason why countries create them, and some are more effective than others, and I'll come back to that a little later when I discuss global governance. Corporations and social movements, extremists, social movements are empowered by social media, and are also ideational. The traditional definition of multipolarity doesn't talk about ideas and norms. It's based on wealth and military capabilities. Now, today, you cannot take out ideational resources, including global norms and also powerful ideas that can cause fundamental change. So we also have, there were always extremists and social movements, but these social movements and extremists today have a global reach that did not have. You have pirates in the 17th century. And the pirates, we had pirates in the Caribbean, we have pirates in Southeast Asia, but today we have terrorist groups, transnational criminal groups, money laundering groups that operate globally. So this is a very different situation, both good and bad, but very different. And the actors are not just great powers or even states. All these other actors do play a very important role using both material but ideational good and bad ideas, like extremist ideology, but also good ideas like human rights. So to call it a multipolar world, to me, misses a big part of the change that has happened. You can call it something, maybe neo-multipolarity or something. But I think multiplex, which is complex, multiple actors, levels of governance with complex interdependence, can be a better fit for the 21st century reality, the world order that we are seeing. So to sum up then, past multipolarity managed by European great powers through balance of power, colonialism, trade manipulation. We had trade wars those days too, but without really institutions. Emerging multiplexity, much greater variety of actors, wider basis of interdependence, trade, finance, production networks and the like. Transnational threats without formal colonialism. I don't think hierarchy and exploitation has gone away, but formal colonialism is today absent, and recognizing the role of ideas today. There's a greater recognition. Ideas always were important, but today we use them, and ideas travel much better today, much faster today because of communication and transport and social media revolution. So I think this is the world order, this is the world we have to keep in mind before we talk about whether the world is on fire, whether peace and cooperation is possible or not. I move to also this idea of what I call economic shift, but idea shift. Now, there has been a major economic shift. Some people just call it power shift. I think power also includes resources like military power. That dispersion is less pronounced, but it is still there. But I want to talk about the economic shift. So the BRICS countries, their share of global GDP increases from 11% in 1990 to 30% in 2014. The global south, and people think when they talk about rising powers, they talk about a few countries. But actually, the trend is that the global south generally is rising in terms of its share of GDP. So by some projection, 57, it's now more than 40% of the world's GDP is generated by Global South, and it'll be projection from OECD is that by 2050 it will be 57%. Now all these calculations are subject to assumptions that can change, but that's generally the trend. And it should not be surprising. You know, in the 18th century, China was the leading economy of the world in terms of gross GDP, and China was a leading economy for 1,000 years. India at some point was number 2. So the rise of Europe since the 17th, or some people say even as recently as 18th century, has only been for a couple of hundred years. So why can't one expect that China or India or other countries will come back to where they were? At least it's a realm of possibility. History might not repeat itself, but history can teach us about a range of possible outcomes, the wider range of possibilities than just what is in the present. So I know you are from the Institute of Contemporary History, but I'm sure many historians here will respect the long cycle of history, long-term trends in history, that opens up the possibility that powers that were once dominant or in terms of leading economic players in the world could actually stage a comeback. And this is particularly salient in the case of China. So South-South linkage is also very important. We used to talk about interdependence in terms of North-North. When Bob Cohen and Joe Nye wrote that book, Power and Interdependence, every IR scholar reads, their case studies are mostly about North-North linkages. So United States, Europe, a little bit of Australia. Now, North-North linkages were important. The structure of world economy depended on that after the World War II. Then it became North-South. Not so much because of the linkages, but also because of the conflicts. But also North-South linkages became important. Now the trend is South-South linkages. The South-South trade is almost a fourth of world trade, a third of FDI flows, all from like less than 10% of the global trade and global FDI. And Asian corporations, excluding Japan, account for a third of global FDI flows and the world's largest investing group. That includes China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and Korea, but not Japan. Now, this is just a little snapshot of a very complex, and these indicators you can find in many other areas that tells you that there is a major economic shift that is in place. At the same time, we have also seen new ideas. There was a time when the Global South used to be basically a protest movement. So reject colonialism, reject anti-superpower intervention. That is only a partial portrayal of the truth. Actually, if you go back and look at some careful studies by Chris Roy-Smith of Australia on human rights, Eric Leiner of Canada on institution building and trade and finance, tells you that the Global South, particularly Latin American countries, and East Europe may not be Global South, but certainly not part of the traditional West, and Asian countries like China, nationalist China, were very closely involved in building global institutions, and African and post-colonial countries, East Asian countries at the Bandung Conference, were very centrally involved in developing not only economic rights, but also political and civil liberties. So you can read Chris Roy-Smith's new, not so new book, the second last book on this. But even then, today we also find that the trade union mentality in the Global South is giving way to a way of contributing positively new ideas and new approaches to peace and development. And this book of mine, Constructing Global Order, is all about that. It's called about agency and change in world politics, and that talks about where agency comes from, and agency comes from a variety of sources. From the West, of course, but also from the Global South, or what used to be called the Third World. And also agency is not material, it's also ideational, and those ideas are very important. And some of the ideas I discuss would be things like they're problem-solving ideas, they're forward-looking ideas, not simply resistant ideas about resistance. They're about human development, human security, responsible sovereignty, common but differentiated responsibility in climate change, and the like. And they come from all sorts of places. And Mahabubul Haq, who created the notion of human development, is a Pakistani and did most of his early work there. although later on he worked through the UNDP. In Bangladesh, we had the microfinance revolution under Muhammad Yunus, by Muhammad Yunus. Kenya, Wangari Maathai, late Wangari Maathai, started the Green Belt movement with a particular idea of how to bring forestry, sustainable forestry, into the concept of sustainable development and security. Very interesting, which I discuss. And these ideas come because they respond to the limitations of Western ideas. In our capitalism, democracy, national security often do not provide a proper fit, close fit for the situation in the global South. Just to give you a quick example, the idea of national security basically emerged out of the United States after World War II. And security here meant protecting your sovereignty and territorial integrity from external military threats. But in most of the third world or global South, the security threats are internal. They're about regime security, rebellions. So how do you put a concept that is geared towards external threats to manage a situation where the main threats are internal, or they have to deal with human security, when the state is the biggest threat to their own people? And people like Muhammad Ayub and Barry Buzan and others have written extensively some of my earlier work. Same thing can go for capitalism and democracy. Regionalism, the European Union is the biggest promoter of regionalism in the world, but unfortunately, its model of regionalism doesn't fit when it is exported to Africa or Latin America. So regionalism there's a chapter on regionalism in my book, both the books, End of American World Order, and there I think it's very important because regionalism is where a lot of agency is exercised from the global South. We cannot mobilize at the global level because many of the institutions are still dominated by the West, so they turn to regional organizations to propagate, share ideas, also experiment with ideas. Now, these ideas spread through localization and adaptation, not just through a whole-scale adoption or mimicking. And you can find that ideas travel through adaptation, including Western ideas, also global South ideas. And those localizing and adaptation, adaptive behavior, adaptive acceptance of ideas is actually a big part of agency. Now, moving on to global governance. This is where I talk about cooperation. Now, this is also very salient because people are now talking about the end of institutions, end of multilateralism, because President Trump doesn't like multilateral institutions, and he prefers transactional bilateral approaches. But global governance was fragmenting for decades. And we did this book called Why Govern. I'll show you very quickly. This is Why Govern, one of my books. Just to 2016. 14 chapters, 9 case studies by 9 different scholars, plus introduction and conclusion. And we found that, hey, first of all, global governance is not considered a good thing by everybody. There has always been some people like President Trump who think global governance is bad. Second, it's never linear. It's not progressive. It rises and falls. And most importantly, it's issue specific. It varies widely across issue areas. When you talk about institutions, multilateralism in what? In climate change, trade, finance, human rights, these are very different. So we found that we looked at demand, why govern, rather than who governs, not the supply or actors. Strong in human rights, strong in security, strong in atrocity prevention, and cyberspace, but very weak in health and trade. Trade particularly. Demand for trade, global governance, has been weak for a long time. That's why WTO has been in crisis for a decade or more than that. And nothing new, by the way. Regional challenges, regional trade arrangements have been growing for decades. And finance comes and goes. If there is a financial crisis, G20 comes up. If there is no financial crisis, it sort of fades from the fades from our attention. So the point is that demand for global governance is never linear, never universal, and therefore, in that sense, it's more resilient, surprisingly. In some areas, it goes up. Some areas, it goes down. And then same with actors. 30 years ago, if you did global governance, you won't probably know the term global governance. It'll be international organization. I mean, I got this award from the international organization section of ISA. It's not a global governance section. So we used to study big multilaterals, the UN system, IMF, World Bank, and GATT or WTO. But today, if you talk about institutions, multilateralism, global governance, you have to bring in regionalism, plurilateralism in trade, multi-stakeholder approaches in cyberspace, humanitarian NGOs in security and refugees. Can't talk about global governance without humanitarian NGOs, especially in security and refugees. Public-private partnership. Can't talk about global governance in health without the Gates Foundation, because it's the biggest spender of global on health after even the WHO cannot function without support from the foundation, Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Climate change. Then you have new parallel institutions. The Chinese have created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, although it's a multilateral institution, and the BRICS have the New Development Bank and Contingent Financial Arrangement. And these are small, but they're emerging, and these are emerging at the global level, not just at the regional level. AIIB is actually regional in scope, but the region is very broadly defined and includes European countries as well as Asian countries. What are the causes? Because the perceived inefficacy of big multilaterals, and the UN system is overstretched and a serious need for reform. So a good example will be the Chinese created or pushed for the AIIB because World Bank and the ADB, Asian Development Bank, stopped spending or lending on infrastructure. But that's the biggest need for Asian countries. So they saw an opportunity, and they created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now everybody is jumping into this. World Bank has restarted it. The United States has restarted its infrastructure projects, lending project window, so has ADB. But the thing is, the Chinese have took the lead in this, and give them credit. We have a lot of issues with the Belt and Road Initiative, but certainly AIIB is a genuinely multilateral institution and functions along the same principles as the big multilateral institutions. And the United States doesn't like institutions where its influence is waning, like the WTO, and this happened even before President Trump. Now, because the United States, there was a time when US, Australia, Canada dominated the WTO. Now it is by China, India, and the new countries. And some of the Western countries don't like that. So they go for a Trans-Pacific Partnership, the plurilateral or regional mechanisms. They renegotiate NAFTA with a shotgun, basically. So we see that there are multiple causes of this. But the outcome, and here is some really both good and bad news. The global governance is fragmenting in the sense of the big institutions are joined by all these other types of actors. But it's not necessarily displacing them. The big institutions are not in the danger of collapsing. In fact, in many cases, these new actors in global governance are complementing. I think humanitarian NGOs complement the UN. I just spoke to all the political heads of all the 36 peacekeeping operations of the UN around the world on Monday in New York. And I was trying to tell them that, they sometimes have skepticism about NGOs, but our book found that the relationship between humanitarian NGOs and the UN operations is generally very positive, despite some immediate quarrels and personality clashes. Health, also the same thing. Private corporations like Gates Foundation, private foundation, and WHO is very positive relationship generally. The regional mechanisms like the Chiang Mai Initiative on finance complements the IMF, as does the European monetary system in handling the Eurozone crisis. So we find that fragmentation, first of all, fragmentation is inevitable. There's not a damn thing you can do about it, because there are so many NGOs and institutions emerging. There's a purpose behind it. Back in the 1940s, we didn't have them so many, so they have to do something. So you better accept it. Some multilateral scholars of multilateralism regret that. They feel worried that these competing mechanisms could undermine global governance. But I think there's no evidence of that. I think they could. First of all, it's inevitable anyway. This is going to happen. So find the best way to deal with this. Non-state corporations or humanitarian NGOs or different types of public-private partnerships. This is a way forward. This is creative rather than destructive. Then finally, very quickly, G+ leadership. Leadership is not just structural, and there is this fancy term by Ian Bremmer and his colleague called G0 world, because he doesn't see there's any leadership left. But that's he's a political scientist, no better. The leadership is not about structural leadership. with using material power and coercion. Warren Young and others for a long time have defined leadership in plural terms. So you can have structural leadership with coercion, material power. You have intellectual leadership with power of ideas. You have entrepreneurial leadership, negotiating skills, and normative, moral principles. That's why Scandinavian countries, Canada, Australia, and Indonesia in the context of Southeast Asia have been leaders. They don't have powers to coerce, but they have made huge differences into the global normative as well as the global development and security climate or environment. So leadership also depends on, just like global governance depends on issue areas. G+, instead of G1, G2, G20, G77, or G8 and G7, or G0, I think G+ is a more realistic world because leadership is no longer solely in the hands of governments through structural power. G+ means more actors, but more types of leadership that you can find than the traditional intergovernmental processes that we are familiar with. So it's different types of leadership exercised by different actors, states, international institutions, corporations, civil society actors, even individuals, non-entrepreneurs, at multiple global, regional, national, and local levels. So go back to the question, peace and development, are peace and cooperation possible? A world on fire. Now, this is very strange because some of the people who talk about this don't look at the long-term trends. So they look at 1 year, 2 year. The long-term trends are studied by databases like Uppsala University, and I think it's the most credible source because unlike some other institutions like IISS in London, they're not funded by the military-industrial complex. So they did a study of conflicts between 1989 to 2007. They looked at 3 types of conflicts. One is state-based, where at least one party is a government. So a state versus another state, or government versus another government, or government versus an organized armed group, leading to 25 or more battle-related deaths in a calendar year. Second type of conflict, non-state actors, which are neither party is a government, like the war between Hamas and another Palestinian group. Neither party is a government. And then one-sided, which means an attack by a government or organized group against civilians with 25 or more deaths per year. And these people have been doing this study for decades and decades. This 1989, but I'll also show you data from 1947. They found that 49 active in 2017, down from 53. So this is when people started talking about the end of the liberal order, world on fire. Conflict actually gone down in one category, including there are 10 wars with 1,000 battle deaths, but generally it has gone down mainly because of Syria. Syria casualties have gone down there. Non-state conflicts have increased in terms of number of non-state groups have increased, but the casualty levels are similar to last year. And category C, one-sided conflict. Also, there are more attacks and more actors attacking civilians, but fatalities also have not increased so much. Now, what they conclude is very interesting. And I can tell you, these people have been studying this from 1947 trends onwards. So they say that 2017 saw a decrease for the 3rd consecutive year to a level 32% lower than the latest peak when Haas and others were talking about the world catching fire, unraveling, and for Zakaria was talking about world on fire, mainly due to declining armed conflict in Syria. But the second one, quote, is most interesting. The overall decrease in fatalities lends support to the claim that conflict deaths are in decline and that world is increasingly peaceful. This trend holds even more strongly when controlling for increases in world population. Now, these people are as quantitative, as careful, as systematic as it gets. Go and visit their website. It's freely available, and they don't take any money from the military-industrial complex. And I have used their data in 2014. I've used their data in 2001, 2007. I follow this. I also follow all kinds of other data that comes out of think tanks and government. I will show you some data on terrorism soon. But I'm not saying the peace is breaking out, but also the world is not catching fire. Why are we focusing on one dimension just because the United States led liberal order is in decline, and don't look at other long-term factors, which I will point out in a moment, where it's possible to think that Trump or no Trump, there will be some long-term institutional and structural and social factors that will make the world, if not entirely peaceful. Nobody says the world will become a paradise, but not this kind of abject pessimism is unjustified. Because, people who say that, they have their own agenda, and it's a political agenda. Now, I may be sounding like a defender of President Trump here. I'm not. But I actually think the liberals are their worst enemies, because they glorified the liberal order, and they are going to the other extreme and turning into abject pessimism and think all hell is breaking loose. Okay, so the other thing is who started those fires. The biggest conflicts in the world today in terms of casualties are Iraq, Afghanistan, and to some extent Syria and Nigeria. Now, as Richard Haas himself would say, some of the reasons of rising disorder are structural, but some are the result of bad choices. So war of necessity, war of choice, he wrote about, made by important players. Put the United States as one of those. And at least some of those can be and should be corrected. Now, again, who started those fires? It's not started by only, bad actors like ISIS or ISIL or Al-Qaeda. It also started by choices made by the managers of the liberal order. So this is data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Project. You can say from 1946, conflict peaked. They talk about 4 types of conflicts. One of the ones here is extra-state, meaning colonial conflicts, colonial wars, when like French war in Algeria and the like, or in Vietnam and the like. Those have pretty much disappeared. Interstate conflicts almost disappeared, less than 5% state-to-state conflict. And the third type is internationalized domestic conflicts that become internationalized through foreign intervention. Now, those are around, and they escalated where foreign powers intervene in places like Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. But the biggest increase in conflict is really domestic, intrastate conflict. And that is the biggest threat to world today in terms of domestic, some people call it ethnic conflict or whatever. And they were picked in 1988, and then they came down quite significantly after the end of the Cold War. They went up a little, but now they can see the last couple of years, and as I said earlier, in 2016, there is a decrease since 2014, the last 3 years. So again, you don't have to take this as on face value. You should go and do your research into this before next time you read a CNN report, the world is catching fire, and because you should keep this in mind, that the trends have to be long-term, and whether the world is peaceful or not after the liberal order depends on long-term cycles of factors and drivers. Now, talk about terrorism. It's also very interesting because this becomes a very important part of the current security debate, and I don't want to underestimate it. But a lot of the terrorism actually is localized. So Iraq, Nigeria, Afghanistan actually are the biggest producers of terrorist-related deaths or sites. So in the Global Terrorism Index, which is based on the University of Maryland terrorism database, found that in 2015, 5 countries, Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Syria, accounted for 72% of all deaths from terrorism. 5 countries. And you can say that Iraq is certainly something that could have been avoided. It did not produce terrorism before the 2003 invasion of the country. And only 4 groups are responsible for 74% of all these deaths. So ISIL, Boko Haram, Taliban, and Al-Qaeda. In 2014, Iraq and Syria took this is from a different database from International Institute of Strategic Studies, who I do not think is a totally neutral source in this, but still is an influential source. Iraq and Syria accounted for 88,000 out of 180,000 of all terrorist deaths. So almost like half. So, and also think of the war on terror, not just terrorism, producing some of these casualties. So civilian deaths in Iraq doubled after the 2003 invasion. And in fact, must be more than that, according to a Harvard study that I'll be happy to share with you later. So And this is the other thing, long-term sources of stability and cooperation. I think there are plenty of sources of disorder in the world, but let's not forget about the long-term sources. The Human Security Report, which is, comes out of University of Simon Fraser University now, used to be British Columbia, and also some of the data that I have analyzed tells us this, that end of colonialism and the Cold War has actually had a positive effect, not negative, positive effect on on conflicts. Economic development is the single most important factor in creating conditions for peace, which is the reason why, despite all the tension in Asia, Asia actually hasn't had a interstate conflict since the Chinese-Vietnamese War in 1979. There are many other reasons for it: nuclear weapons, deterrence, balance of power, but also economic development, because this is the fastest growing region in the world for the last 30 years. Proliferation, economic interdependence, which being undermined now, but certainly has been a big factor, especially in US-China relations, and still is a big factor, because it hasn't touched the finance side yet. Only that there is a trade war. There is no finance war yet between US and China, and we'll see whether it goes to that, Trump goes to that extent. Proliferation of global and regional institutions that can mediate in conflicts, UN and regional organizations, peacemaking, humanitarian intervention, these are a factor. Norms against war, as Gareth Evans, the former Australian foreign minister, put it, the notion that war is noble and can be purifying and cleansing is dead beyond redemption. Now, you just have to look at the late 19th century or 19th century European politics to see that every time there was a threat to the balance of power, European leaders thought war as a necessary way of correcting the imbalance. War was seen as a necessary means for correcting the sort of threat to the balance of power. And nobody thinks like that. No leader is crazy enough to think of war, not even Kim Jong-un, to think of war as a necessary way of solving a problem. So new norms like R2P and war crimes and genocide, anti-war crimes and genocide norms, war crime tribunal trials by ICC and other tribunals, even though some countries may walk out of ICC, it does have a deterrent effect. It comes out when you do your field work in countries like Africa or in Asia increasingly. And then the point I already made, the demand for global governance. Because it's never linear, we shouldn't be shocked that people are not very positive about multilateralism today. It is always issue specific. So I don't think demand for climate change governance is going down in the same way as demand for trade governance. And if there is a financial crisis tomorrow, there will be another effort by G20. It is crisis driven. And also, we found in that book, Why Govern, that demand is driven not just by normative factors. Not everybody thinks global governance is a good thing. Some people think global governance is absolutely necessary to solve a problem, like climate change. So it's driven by functional factors and also strategic factors. Some people think global governance, participating in global governance enhances their international prestige. So they're willing to make some concessions. And China is like that. It's not entirely normative and moral about global governance, but it sees also global governance as a way to boost Chinese prestige and image in the world. So every country, every great power thinks like that, under different leaders, of course. So because, and the demanders of global governance are not just states, but also non-state actors or different types of states. The moral of the story is that if one state, or one issue area goes down the radar or below the radar, falls below the radar, other demanders will compensate for it. Other issue areas will come up where global governance, for different reasons, either for normative, strategic, or other. So the demand is elastic and not linear, which is why I'm not very pessimistic about the prospect for international cooperation. I think we may have a blip, and this has happened before, and also if it goes down in trade, it will go up in some other area. The world is not going to be in disarray in the way Richard Haas talks about. Certainly, I don't see it to that extent. So this is my conclusion then, and if you want to read more, here are my 4 books, or 3 books. One is the second edition. The 2018 was on sale after that. It was published taking into account the effect of the Trump presidency. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you very much for this exhaustive introduction and also the hopeful message. If you see the title Peace and Cooperation After the Liberal Order, perhaps the flippant response would be no, it isn't possible. And so it's good to hear the degree of optimism. We have about 20 minutes, 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. So if you would step up to the microphone, maybe very briefly identify yourself and ask a question if you're so inclined.
Thank you. So you don't mind if I take a picture? I always do that. I have a Twitter account, by the way. It's @Amitav Acharya. So welcome to follow me. I always tweet about these issues. Okay.
I'll ask a question. Thank you for a great talk. Put yourself in the room of the Council of Foreign Relations, and maybe you've been in that room. You're advising American policymakers or American voters on what America should be doing in this new world order. What's your advice?
Yeah, the Council on Foreign Relations doesn't like me anymore. So I published a few articles in Foreign Affairs before, and I participated in the project, but they would not help me launch my book, so I'm doing it with Carnegie Endowment. Thankfully, in Washington, we have multiple think tanks who can balance each other. In fact, you can find that this book's introduction, second edition, starts with an article, a series of articles, refers to a series of articles. Within a month of Trump presidency, Foreign Affairs come out with a special issue referring to the liberal order in past tense, the order that we will soon miss. And Joe Nye, who's a very good friend of mine, and we teach together in China in a course, he actually is very sympathetic to my view, and he actually cited me, and he reviewed my book. But tell me there is one article in Foreign Affairs about the decline of liberal order before Trump. Not. Because I think it's like what John F. Kennedy said, while Europe slept. While the liberals slept, the order was already fraying. And in a sense, you can't blame them. Obama lifted their spirit, after George W. Bush. And then everybody assumed Hillary will succeed Obama, and she is an internationalist. And we'll continue business as usual. So I can't blame them. I mean, I didn't predict Trump being president. I actually thought Hillary will win, and I supported her. But what advice would I give? I would certainly not give this advice to Council on Foreign Relations, because it's a like-minded group of liberals. Actually, if I was to say something, first of all, do not pine for the return of the liberal order. It's gone, especially the liberal hegemony. The liberal international order will not disappear completely. There will always be liberal elements in world politics. But the idea of a liberal hegemony, this is the order that will co-opt China, BRICS, this is gone. Except that the world is being more decentered, more pluralistic. I do not say in my book the United States is declining. In fact, why the book became quite popular outside of the United States, at least, or even in the United States in the academic community, it made a distinction between the decline of the US and the decline of the liberal order. I said the two things are completely different and cannot be conflated. The liberal order will decline. Whether the US is declining or not, we don't know. The statistics points to either direction. You can play it in both ways. So we have this wave. Sometimes people say, it's going to decline. America is in decline. America is not in decline. To me, that's really less important than the order America built that is declining. So that's the argument of this book. I will tell them, do not pine for the return of the liberal order. Negotiate with the rising powers. Some of them are your partners in some areas. Some areas you can be competitor, but you have to coexist with him. And thirdly, I think Obama and Hillary had it right. They were willing to accept the relative decline of the United States, at least the first Obama term. They were willing to engage regional powers, regional institutions, play the multilateral game. That's a pretty good foreign policy. So I don't have to go very far to say where the good foreign policy of the United States will be. At the same time, I do have to tell you that not anywhere else but in Washington, D.C., there is a groupthink where they can't think beyond the primacy of the liberal order. And they conflate the liberal order with the United States. You can tell them the two are separate. You can still be number one, but have a different type of order. It's simply, there's a cognitive dissonance. So I say, Democrat or Republican, America is number one. That's all they think about in DC. Very few people think out of the box. But elsewhere in the United States, I gave a talk like this in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with the World Affairs Council. And it was a very different reaction, very different mindset. I gave a talk like this in the West Coast, very different mindset. So that's what I'll say, that you have a, United States has a rich array, menu of foreign policy choices. And some of them are as recent as the last administration. So get the best out of it, but still have to accept that this order is not going to come back. So you can make America great again, but you can't make liberal order great again. Okay.
So I noticed one of the things you were talking about when you were drawing distinctions between the era of liberal hegemony and the contemporary world order being normative leadership, and you were talking about self-determination in that discussion. You're drawing comparison with the era of liberal hegemony with the contemporary world order. And I was wondering, if you could kind of, interrogate that a little bit further, because, you're also bringing up this statistic about violence in the contemporary world and how most of it is interstate, and a lot of that is wars of self-determination. And so I was wondering if you could kind of interrogate, the idea of self-determination in a post-colonial age and its usefulness or its limitations, maybe kind of address that topic.
So very briefly, the answer has to do with what do you mean by self-determination and what is this link with human rights and sovereignty. So, one chapter, this whole book, by the way, Constructing Global Order, is about sovereignty and security. Sovereignty went through, sovereignty is not the same thing for all the people. It's a European Westphalian concept, non-intervention being the critical norm of sovereignty. But what the Europeans meant by non-intervention is not what the Asians mean by non-intervention. And what the Asians mean by non-intervention is not what the Africans or Latin Americans mean by non-intervention. There's a lot of variation. Same with self-determination. So sovereignty was seen as a moral norm. Now everybody thinks sovereignty is bad because it sanctions human rights violation. But in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, when many global South countries were emerging out of colonialism, they saw sovereignty as equally moral and self-determination as moral. It is true that they abused it and used sovereignty and self-determination to oppress their people. Some of the countries did, for sure. But they certainly did not see sovereignty in a negative light, the way Europeans saw after World War II. The Europeans thought sovereignty and nationalism was to be blamed for 2 world wars, so we have to create a supranational authority. But so my point is that to understand the importance, never think of sovereignty and self-determination as a singular, timeless concept. And there's a lot more to it. Lot more variation, and this is what a constructivist view will take you, that to interpret the multiple origins and multiple contexts of those norms. Yes?
So an integral aspect of this idea of a multiplex world seems to be that the sovereign state is now jostling with NGOs and corporations and these other types of non-state actors. But in many ways, mostly outside of the liberal West, these NGOs, these corporations are in many ways being brought under heel by, China is the biggest example. So, I don't think that's, I would sort of ask you about whether you think that trend is going to expand outside of the sort of liberal West, because that's where NGOs have more cultural and soft power purchase. And in many ways, an NGO report about China's abuses on the Uyghurs is not going to, Chinese leaders don't care about that in many ways, right? So I'm just sort of wondering whether you see that focus on or sort of that trend
Yeah.
about sovereignty and how that, because in many ways we're seeing a reassertion of state sovereignty. So I just wonder if you could speak
So
to that.
yeah, I think it's a good point. I would not go as far as to say that the state is becoming important or irrelevant. I think the idea of multiplexity is to move away from a great power-centric world. The great powers are the ones that really matter and manage global affairs. In the case of NGOs, it varies from place to place, but I'm not talking about only NGOs. I'm talking about other types of non-state actors, and also movements, people's movements, which are a very important factor, empowered by social media, and corporations, and private foundations. So simply the number of consequential actors in world politics, it's much greater today than it was in the 19th or early 20th century. That is not to say that state is going to become irrelevant. I don't go to that far. It's not that kind of a approach of a social movement or globalization and the end of the nation state kind of an approach. But state is one of the actors, and in some cases, non-state actors actually play both good and bad, a bigger role in shaping security and development in the global south, and also in the global north as well. So the other thing I would say is that when you talk about this whole idea of multiplex world, also think about levels of governance. So global governance, globalization, almost always focuses attention on the global level or international level. I think a lot of the world politics now has always been, and increasingly so, is regionalized. Now, if you want to understand Middle East politics today or security, yeah, United States, Russia, they matter, but what Saudis and Turks and the Qataris and Israelis do, and Iranians, is basically the basic determinant of Middle East politics. The regional powers are really important in understanding Middle East politics. The way, in the Cold War, the superpowers had an overarching control over global geopolitics. That's not the case. The multiplex world is also a regionalized world, and not just in terms of actors, but levels of order building. Yeah.
War was once best described as a necessity on the road to establishing...
Can you speak up a little?
Sorry. War was once best described as a necessity on the road to establishing and building sovereign states, but now that state building takes place in a globalized context, do you believe that the changing global order is changing the nature of war?
Sorry, I didn't get the last part of it.
Do you believe that the changing global order is changing the nature of war?
Changing the nature of the world.
Of war.
Nature of war, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you.
I mean, yeah, it's like chicken and egg. I mean, changing nature of war, also changing global order. I mean, there's no question that the main source of violence in the world is domestic, intrastate. And that means, but our multilateral institutions were created at a time when the main scores of the war, main scores of order was interstate conflict. So you look at the United Nations, very clear example. The UN was based on the principle of collective security. The collective security is a very state-centric notion. So when an aggressor, you have a victim, all the states will rise up and punish the aggressor. UN Charter, the preamble mentions the word non-intervention. The United Nations, all the treaties and documents talk about the state with a capital S. So it's a very state-centric institution, which is why it took a long time for the UN to get into internal conflicts. And also regional organizations, the same thing. They basically mimic the UN in terms of adhering to non-intervention as a foundational principle. But you see, the collective security has never worked, and it has never been even needed. What has been needed is peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is not in the UN Charter. It's a Canadian invention. Because the UN could not function because of the Cold War, so it has to do something, and the peacekeeping, keeping the factions separate, seemed to be more relevant, more doable than this elusive notion of collective security. And now, after the Cold War, we have this proliferation of ethnic conflicts, interstate conflicts, so we have to have humanitarian intervention, R2P. So the original purpose of the UN is changed completely, drastically. There is no real UN peacekeeping operation today. There are very few, maybe 2 or 3 out of 36, which directly concern in state-to-state conflict. So that's my point. So the changing nature of conflict is also reshaping what the UN does. And since the UN is foundational to world order, that's what we should be looking at. And where the NGOs come in, therefore, why all these other actors, by the way. Most of these new actors I'm talking about, corporations, private groups, and social movements, humanitarian groups, they play a far more important role in internal conflicts than in interstate conflicts. Nobody will bring an NGO into an India-Pakistan nuclear war. But when there is a refugee crisis, humanitarian crisis, a Rohingya crisis, NGOs come in. So that is also creating the impetus away from this traditional multipolar conception of world politics to what I call a multiplexity, because the nature of conflict is changing. So your point is a very good one, but I would put it slightly differently. It's not the order that is changing the conflict, changing world order, creating new forms of conflict. It's the other way around. Any more?
Well, I think we've fairly thoroughly exhausted you. You've fairly thoroughly exhausted yourself.
I'm enjoying myself. Thank you very much.
I do want to thank you for helping us launch this lecture series with such a terrific reflection. And I'm struck by the fact that the Baker Peace Conference this spring, and this was actually not really coordinated in that sense, is in fact about kind of the making of that liberal order after World War II and the challenges it's faced since.
We start with the unmaking of the order first, and then go to the making.
But it is in that respect actually really good introduction to the theme, and for that I want to thank you as well.
Well, I'm very grateful for coming here and really enjoyed it. And please take a look at some of the writings and follow me on Twitter.